For 8 years, he lived alone, no one but the wind and his horses to speak to. Then, in the dead of a stormy night, a desperate knock brought 10 Apache women to his door, women hunted, broken, fighting for their lives. What happens next will test everything he thought he knew about fear, loyalty, and survival. Stay with us, this story will grip you from start to finish. I had been alone for nearly a decade, 8 years, to be exact, living with nothing but the wind's whispers and the quiet neighs of my horses for company. My world was a small patch of land fenced off from everything else, a place where memories didn't chase me, where ghosts of the past couldn't find a voice to scream through the silence. That night, the sky was angry, thunder rumbled overhead, rain lashing the earth like bullets. I sat near my fire, hands worn and steady as I mended a worn leather saddle. The kind of work that keeps a man grounded, steady, away from the storms brewing inside his head. But then a knock shattered the rhythm. It wasn't a polite tap, it wasn't a neighbor asking for a cup of sugar, it was desperate, urgent, the kind of knock that makes you freeze, your heart beat a sudden wild drum. I hadn't heard that sound in years, voices, soft but trembling, speaking in a language that set every nerve on edge. Apache. My blood ran cold. I gripped the rifle mounted above the fireplace, a relic from a past life where I'd kept one eye open, ready for the worst. I didn't want to open that door. Not again, not after everything I'd lost. But then the voice came again, closer this time, a woman's voice breaking through the storm, pleading. They were out there, 10 women, running from men who wanted them dead, and if I didn't open that door, they would die out there in the rain, cold, alone. And if those men found their bodies at my gate, I'd be dead too. So, after 8 years of silence, 8 years of turning my back on the world, I lifted the iron bar that sealed me away. The door creaked open, and there they were, 10 Apache women, soaked and broken, their clothes torn, faces marked by exhaustion and pain. A baby, barely breathing, nestled in the arms of the youngest among them. Their leader stood tall despite the blood trickling down her face and the weight of fear in her eyes. She was no helpless refugee, she was a warrior. And by the time that night was over, I would understand what it truly meant to fight for survival and justice. I stood there, the storm raging all around us, the heavy wooden door wide open, letting the cold night seep inside. 10 women, drenched and weary, pressed into my small home like shadows seeking refuge from a relentless storm. The youngest cradled a baby so fragile it seemed the slightest movement might break it. For 8 years, I had lived here like a ghost, locked away from a world that had betrayed me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of the wind through the cracks reminded me of what I had lost, my family, my peace, my reason to hope. And now, suddenly, that fragile barrier was shattered by a group of strangers whose pain echoed mine in ways I wasn't ready to confront. The woman who had spoken to me at the door, Ayana, stood with a quiet strength that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. Her gaze held mine for a moment, a silent plea wrapped in steel. She told me they'd been running for 3 days, chased by soldiers who saw them as enemies, threats to be eliminated. I could hear it all, the undercurrent of desperation in her voice, the weight of a story that had been carved into her bones by fire and blood. She spoke of villages burned, families torn apart, and men who wore uniforms but had long forgotten the meaning of honor. I felt the chill in my gut, deep in the kind of cold that wasn't from the storm, but from the knowledge that the violence hunting them was very real and very close. My mind raced back to my own memories, back to Sarah and her daughter. The last time I heard Apache spoken at my doorstep was the last time I heard their laughter, saw their smiles. That morning the world had shattered, and I'd buried my pain under 8 years of silence and solitude. Now, with these women in my house, those memories clawed their way to the surface. The air felt thick with ghosts. I motioned toward the kitchen, where a hidden cellar lay beneath the floorboard stone walls and a narrow entrance, the perfect place to hide. But Ayana shook her head. If the soldiers searched and found the cellar empty, they would kill us all anyway. They'd see me as an accomplice, and my quiet life would end in flames. Her words hit harder than the rain against the windows. I knew she was right. There was no running from this night, no hiding in silence. Outside, the storm began to ease just enough for me to catch sounds I didn't want to hear, the faint clip-clop of horses in the mud, voices shouting orders, men who believed they held the upper hand. For the first time in years, the weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. I wasn't just a broken man anymore, I was a protector, and the line between justice and vengeance was about to blur. As I moved to secure the windows and check the rifle by the hearth, I felt the eyes of the women on me, not with fear, but with something fierce, a silent promise that they wouldn't go down without a fight. I knew I had to be ready, because the men coming were not just soldiers. They were predators with a mission, and their hunt was almost over. That night, in the storm's dying breath, I realized something. Survival meant more than just hiding. It meant standing up, drawing a line in the dirt, and being willing to face the darkness head on. And so, with the storm behind us and the coming battle before us, we prepared. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across the worn wooden walls of my cabin. Outside, the storm had quieted to a steady drizzle, but inside, the tension was a different kind of tempest, one that roared beneath the surface, threatening to break loose at any moment. 10 women, once strangers, now huddled close in the cramped space. Their presence filled the small house with a strange energy, part fear, part resolve, part unspoken history. They carried wounds I couldn't begin to count, but what struck me most was the way they held themselves, not as victims, but as survivors hardened by the cruelest of fates. Ayana, their leader, sat near the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flames, sharp and unyielding. I watched her, trying to read the layers beneath the exhaustion, the fierceness, the pain, the simmering fire that refused to die. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for justice, for vengeance, for the right to exist on land soaked with blood and silence. I looked around my cabin, the place I'd thought was a sanctuary, a refuge from a world that had taken everything from me. Now it felt like a battleground waiting to be drawn. The cracked floorboards beneath our feet held the weight of decisions I'd long avoided. The baby in the youngest woman's arms let out a soft whimper, breaking the silence. I moved closer, my hand brushing a blanket around the fragile bundle. Life, it seemed, had a stubborn way of clinging to the edge, even when everything else seemed lost. Hours slipped by, measured by whispered conversations in Apache, the soft rustle of bandages being wrapped, and the occasional crackle of the dying fire. I thought about the men hunting them, soldiers who wore uniforms like armor but carried cruelty beneath their badges. Captain Morrison, their ruthless leader, whose name I'd heard whispered with fear and hatred. A man who saw us as nothing more than obstacles to be erased. The thought made my hands clench into fists. Memories rose unbidden of my wife's laughter, my daughter's bright eyes, and the morning I lost them both. The day my world crumbled into silence. I'd spent years building walls around my heart, trying to bury the pain beneath isolation and distance. But these women, with their scars and their stories, were tearing those walls down. They were a reminder that pain was not a prison, it was a call to arms. Outside, the rain eased further, turning to a mist that clung to the earth. The sounds of horses approached again, louder this time, echoing through the valley like a drumbeat of impending violence. I checked my rifle once more, the cold metal a strange comfort in my hands. It was a relic from a life I'd tried to leave behind, but tonight it felt like the only thing standing between us and death. The women moved with purpose, positioning themselves in the shadows, weapons hidden but ready. Their courage was palpable, a force that settled the knot in my stomach. Ayana's voice broke through the quiet, low and steady, as she laid out the grim truth. Reinforcements were coming, more men than we could face head on. There was no turning back. The night stretched thin, every second heavy with dread and determination. I found myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this night was the reckoning I'd been waiting for, the chance to reclaim something lost, to fight not just for survival but for redemption. And as the first horsemen appeared as dark shapes beyond the window, I felt the old man inside me awaken, the man who had learned to survive by facing the storm, not hiding from it. Because sometimes the only way out of the darkness was through the fire. The night pressed in close, the walls of my cabin seeming to shrink with every passing minute. Outside, the mist clung to the earth like a veil, hiding the movements of those who hunted us. Inside, silence was a luxury none of us could afford. I paced the length of the small room, rifle in hand, feeling the weight of every breath, every heartbeat. The women were silent too, their faces set like stone as they prepared themselves for the inevitable. Ayana moved with a quiet command, her eyes scanning each of us, measuring strength and resolve. She was more than a leader, she was a storm in human form, fierce and unyielding. She reminded me of the rivers I'd seen in my youth, calm on the surface, but with a current beneath that could sweep away everything in its path. Her people had suffered more than any soul should endure, hunted across the land, their homes reduced to ashes. And yet here they were, standing tall despite the wounds etched into their skin and spirit. The youngest woman cradled the baby closer, her fingers trembling but her gaze steady. Life had not given them any easy gifts, but that fragile child was a beacon proof that hope could still flicker in the darkest places. I thought about my own losses, the family I'd buried beneath years of solitude and silence. How often had I wished for a chance to fight back, to rewrite the story fate had handed me. Tonight, perhaps, was that chance. Outside, the soft thud of hooves in the mud grew louder, a grim reminder that time was slipping through our fingers like sand. I moved toward the hidden cellar beneath the kitchen floor, a place I'd built years ago for storing supplies, never imagining it would one day be a refuge for hunted souls. It was cramped, cold, and dark, but it was safety in a world gone mad. Ayana shook her head when I suggested it. If they find the cellar empty, they will burn this place to the ground, she said quietly. And you with it. Her words cut deeper than any blade. There was no room for half measures tonight. We needed a plan. I remembered the tools I'd hidden away long ago. Dynamite, fuses, the kind of explosives that could bring down mountains or tear open a dam. It was a dangerous gamble, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. This land, I said, it's not just home, it's a weapon. I built a dam upstream to control the floods. If we blow it during the storm, the valley will fill with water, and any attackers caught downstream will be swept away. Ayana's eyes lit with a spark of hope. That could work, she said, but it will destroy your land. Home had been a prison for me for 8 years, a reminder of loss and regret. Tonight it might be the ground where we made our last stand. We gathered what we could, packing the cabin with hidden weapons, checking ammunition and sharing silent looks that spoke louder than words. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting faces in the dim light, each etched with fear and determination. We were preparing for a battle we might not survive, but survival wasn't the only goal. Justice was. I thought about Captain Morrison, the man who had hunted these women with a cold cruelty that no uniform could hide. He believed we were weak, that we would cower and beg. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The first gunshot cracked through the night like a thunderclap, sending a shiver down my spine. The hunt had begun. I took my position by the window, rifle ready. Ayana and her sisters melted into the shadows, poised like ghosts waiting to strike. As the soldiers advanced, expecting an easy victory, they walked into a trap as old as the land itself, a trap forged from pain, vengeance, and unyielding spirit. The storm outside had passed, but inside, a new storm was rising, and this one would not be weathered quietly. The first gunshot shattered the night's fragile silence like a gunpowder blast echoing through the valley. It was sharp and sudden, an explosion that stole the breath from my lungs and ignited the storm we'd all been bracing for. Outside the windows, torches flickered in the darkness. The soldiers approached, no longer hidden by mist or rain. They came like shadows cast by vengeance, confident, cruel, and utterly unprepared for the resistance waiting inside. The room tightened around us. 10 women, scarred by relentless pursuit and sharpened by survival, moved with the quiet precision of predators. They weren't the helpless refugees Captain Morrison had expected. cowering behind a broken man's door. No, they were warriors forged in the fires of loss and rage, ready to make their stand. I took my position by the front window, heart pounding beneath my worn leather jacket, my fingers wrapped around the cold steel of my rifle, the weapon an extension of my will. For 8 years I'd held onto this rifle like a lifeline, a relic of a life I tried to forget. Tonight it was the only thing between us and death. Ayana's voice was a whisper in the shadows, sharp and steady. Wait for my signal. Her gaze locked with mine, fierce, unyielding, full of a promise that this night would end in blood or freedom. The others melted into the darkness, disappearing into the corners and shadows like ghosts summoned by the firelight. The soldiers moved closer, their boots splashing through the mud, rifles raised, voices hushed but tense. They thought us weak, easy prey. They didn't know the hell we'd been through, or the fury that had taken root in our hearts. A figure appeared at the front door, Captain Morrison himself. His boots hit the porch with a cold certainty, rifle gripped tightly, eyes scanning for weakness. He was the embodiment of the cruelty that had hunted us for so long. I watched him, waiting, breathing in the heavy air that crackled with anticipation. Then Ayana raised the small polished mirror, catching the firelight in a sudden flash, a signal. I pulled the trigger before the echo of his signal faded. The bullet tore through the air, striking Morrison's arm as he flinched back in surprise. Chaos erupted. The room exploded into motion. Blades flashed in the dim light, guns cracked like thunderclaps, and the sharp scent of gunpowder mixed with sweat and blood. The women fought like the fierce spirits of the land, swift and merciless. Some wielded knives, others took rifles from fallen soldiers, turning their weapons against the enemy. Every movement was calculated, a deadly dance choreographed by months of running, hiding, and fighting for their lives. I felt a rush of adrenaline surge through me as I reloaded and fired again, keeping the soldiers at bay. My hands shook, but my resolve hardened. This was no longer just survival. This was a reckoning. Through the chaos, I caught glimpses of faces contorted with rage and fear. Soldiers who thought they were hunting prey now found themselves hunted. The ground beneath us trembled not from the storm but from the fury of those who refused to be broken. A scream cut through the night, sharp, desperate, a cry that will haunt me forever. One of the women fell, clutching a wound in her side, eyes blazing with defiance even as blood soaked her clothes. Ayana was everywhere at once, moving like a shadow, her blade flashing with deadly precision. She struck down 2 men near the back door, then vanished into the smoke and dust as the fight raged on. I fought with a fury I didn't know I still had, each breath burning in my lungs, each shot a message to the men who dared to come here and threaten us. Time lost meaning. The night stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of battle, the crack of rifles, the clash of steel, the shouts and cries of warriors and killers alike. And then, as quickly as it began, the soldiers began to falter, their numbers thinning, their confidence cracking under the relentless assault. But the cost was clear. Our sanctuary was no longer safe. The land itself seemed to mourn the violence, the mud turning slick with blood and rain. I looked around at the faces, illuminated by the firelight, wounded, fierce, unbroken. We had fought back, we had drawn blood, but the war was far from over. Ayana's voice came to me through the haze, calm and steady despite the chaos. Reinforcements are coming, more than we expected. The sound of distant hooves echoed through the valley again, heavier, faster. We were not just fighting for this night, we were fighting for every tomorrow. I felt the old weight settle back on my shoulders, the weight of choices, of sacrifices, of the line drawn between justice and survival. And as the first light of dawn threatened the horizon, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. Because sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not just with weapons, but with the courage to stand when everything else tells you to fall. The night had stretched itself thin, torn apart by gunfire, whispered prayers, and the ragged breathing of those who clung stubbornly to life. Outside, the storm had finally relented, leaving a cold mist that clung to the trees and seeped through the cracks of my cabin like a living thing. Inside, the air was thick with blood, sweat, and the heavy weight of what we'd already endured and what was still to come. I sank to the floor beside the hearth, my rifle resting across my knees as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched over the horizon. Every muscle screamed with exhaustion, but my mind was racing, counting the cost, calculating what we had left and wondering if it was enough. Ayana was nearby, her face streaked with grime and sweat, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. She had survived worse, I knew, but I could see the toll the fight had taken on her, on all of us. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore, it was a crucible forging something new. I thought of the baby, the fragile symbol of hope, tucked in the arms of the youngest woman. Somehow, amid this chaos, that small life had been shielded from harm. It was a miracle I didn't fully understand, but one I wasn't about to question. Outside, the sounds of the soldiers' retreat faded into the mist, but the distant thunder of horses told a grim truth. Reinforcements were on their way. We had won this fight, but the war was far from over. I forced myself to stand, every movement a sharp reminder of pain and fatigue. The others were tending to wounds, wrapping bandages, and sharing what little water we had left. There was no time to grieve, not yet. Memories pressed against my mind of Sarah's laughter, the quiet mornings before the world broke, the dreams I'd buried beneath years of solitude. I hadn't realized how much I needed this fight, not just for them, but for myself. This night was a chance to reclaim something lost, to rewrite the ending I'd thought was set in stone. Ayana approached me, her voice low but steady. They'll come in force, more than before. They want to end this tonight. I nodded, gripping my rifle tighter. Then we make sure they don't leave alive. She looked at me, a ghost of a smile flickering across her lips. You're not the man I expected when I first saw you. Neither are you, I replied. But maybe that's what this night needs. We spent the next hours preparing, setting traps around the cabin, moving quietly through the shadows, and sharing stories that kept the fire of hope alive, despite the darkness pressing in. I learned more about these women, their names, their losses, the fierce pride that refused to be extinguished. They were more than survivors. They were the pulse of a land that refused to forget. As the sun broke free from the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, we steeled ourselves for what was coming. The ground trembled again, the sound of hooves pounding like thunder, voices shouting orders, and the cold certainty of soldiers who believed they would finish what they started. But this time we were ready. The battle ahead would test every ounce of strength, courage, and sacrifice we had left. Because in the end, survival wasn't enough. We had to fight for something greater, the right to live free, to remember the past without being chained by it, and to face the dawn with our heads held high. And as I stood there, rifle in hand, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The sun was barely a pale promise on the horizon when the first echo of hooves reached our ears again, a steady, relentless drumbeat that shook the earth beneath us. The soldiers were coming back, and this time they brought numbers that turned certainty into dread. Inside the cabin, silence fell like a shroud. No more whispered plans or quiet preparations. The air was thick with a tension so dense it felt like the walls themselves might collapse under its weight. Faces, once calm or resolute, now flickered with shadows of fear and fierce determination. Ayana stood by the window, her silhouette etched against the dim light. Her eyes scanned the approaching riders, noting every detail, their formation, their pace, the grim set of their jaws. This was no mere patrol. This was a hunt, a reckoning, a final march toward either our annihilation or our deliverance. I gripped my rifle tighter, muscles coiled like springs ready to snap. Every heartbeat thudded in my ears as memories surged unbidden. The laughter of a family I'd lost, the ache of solitude, the bitterness of years spent running from pain. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, all that mattered was the fight. Outside, the first torches broke through the creeping mist, flickering like vengeful stars in the dark. The soldiers dismounted swiftly, boots sinking into the mud, their rifles raised and steady. They moved with the precision of trained killers, but beneath the discipline was a cruel arrogance, a belief that victory was theirs, before the battle even began. But they hadn't met us yet. I turned to the women gathered inside, their faces pale but unbroken. Each of them carried a story of loss and survival, every scar a testament to battles fought and endured. They weren't just hiding. They were waiting, preparing, planning to fight back with everything they had. Ayana caught my eye and nodded once, sharp and sure. The signal. We moved like shadows, slipping into positions we'd marked long before, weapons hidden but ready. The cabin became a fortress forged from desperation and willpower. We knew these walls wouldn't hold forever, but tonight they were our shield. The first shots rang out sharp cracks that split the dawn like lightning. Bullets whizzed through the air, splintering wood and sending shards flying. I fired back, heart pounding, breath ragged. Every shot was a prayer, every movement a vow. The battle spilled into the open, chaos erupting like a violent storm. The women fought with a ferocity that stole my breath, knives flashing, rifles blazing, voices rising in cries of pain and defiance. I was no longer just a man haunted by the past. I was a warrior reborn, fighting alongside these fierce souls who had given me a purpose. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours as the struggle raged on, blood soaking the earth, sweat mixing with rain, the air thick with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. I saw friends fall, heard screams that tore at my heart, but saw also the unbreakable spirit that refused to yield. We were no longer prey. We were predators in our own right. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on the battlefield, the soldiers faltered. Their lines broke, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance. But victory was still a distant dream. Reinforcements thundered in from the ridge, fresh men armed and ready, their arrival a grim reminder that the night's fight was far from over. Ayana's voice reached me over the din, steady and commanding. "Fall back to the woods. We can't hold here." We retreated through the dense trees surrounding the cabin, mud sucking at our boots, hearts heavy but unbowed. The forest swallowed us, hiding scars and stories, whispers of battles fought in shadows. As we regrouped beneath the ancient pines, I felt a fierce determination hardening inside me. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The fight for justice, for freedom, for our very lives, would rage on, and we would face it not as hunted, but as hunters. The forest breathed around us, alive with whispered secrets and the crunch of boots on fallen leaves. The cabin, once our sanctuary, now lay behind us, a battered relic swallowed by smoke and blood. We had retreated, yes, but the fight was far from over. If anything, the wilderness now seemed to pulse with a dangerous energy, as if the very earth was waiting to witness the final reckoning. Ayana gathered us beneath a canopy of ancient pines, her voice low but fierce. "They will hunt us through these woods," she warned, "but this land is ours too. We know its shadows, its hidden paths." The women, still bruised and battered, looked to her with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce resolve. The baby in the youngest woman's arms slept fitfully, unbothered by the danger that cloaked us like a shroud. I stood apart for a moment, rifle slung over my shoulder, heart heavy with memories. The quiet of the woods was a stark contrast to the chaos we'd left behind, but the silence felt like a coiled spring tense and ready to explode. The soldiers wouldn't stop. They couldn't. To them this was a mission, a hunt sanctioned by orders and duty. To us it was a war for survival, for justice, for the right to exist beyond fear. I looked at Ayana, her face streaked with grime, eyes sharp as broken glass. She was no longer just a leader. She was the embodiment of all our pain and hope, a living testament to the unyielding spirit of her people. "We make our stand here," she said. "We use the forest. We turn the hunt back on them. We spread out, setting traps and preparing ambushes in the dense underbrush. The women move with a practiced stealth, their knowledge of the land a weapon as deadly as any rifle. Every broken branch, every rustle of leaves became part of the trap we laid for those who followed. Hours passed in tense silence. The sun arced slowly overhead, shadows shifting and stretching, as if marking the countdown to the next battle. Then, as dusk began to bleed into night, the first signs of pursuit appeared footprints pressed into the soft earth, the faint murmur of voices drifting on the wind. The hunt was resuming. I crouched beside Ayana, fingers tightening on my rifle. "How many do you think?" I asked. "More than before," she answered grimly, "and they'll be looking for us everywhere." The first shots rang out like thunderclaps, ripping through the forest's quiet. The soldiers had come, pushing through the trees with brutal efficiency, but we were ready. The battle in the woods was unlike any before, chaotic, primal, a deadly dance between light and shadow. Bullets zipped through the branches, mingling with the sharp crack of snapping twigs as warriors and hunters clashed in the undergrowth. I fired into the darkness, each shot a desperate prayer. Around me, the women moved like phantoms, silent, deadly, fierce. They struck with knives, set traps that sent men sprawling, their war cries swallowed by the roar of the forest. But the cost was mounting. Screams pierced the night. The sound of pain and loss carried on the wind. I saw a young woman fall, clutching her leg, eyes wide with shock and defiance. Another stepped forward to cover her retreat, blood staining her hands. I felt the pang of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: fear. Not for me, but for them, for the fragile hope we carried like a flame in the dark. Ayana shouted commands, her voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Hold the line! Don't let them surround us!" The soldiers pressed harder, their numbers overwhelming, their tactics brutal, but we fought with everything we had, our backs to the trees, our spirits unbroken. I caught a glimpse of Morrison's second-in-command falling to a hidden pit trap, his scream echoing like a curse through the night. Minutes felt like hours. Every breath burned, every movement was a gamble with death. And yet, in the heart of the fight, something shifted. The soldiers' confidence began to falter. Their assaults grew reckless, desperation creeping into their eyes. We were not just survivors, we were avengers. But the forest held its own price. Shadows danced close, and I felt the cold hand of lost brush against my soul. A bullet grazed my shoulder, searing pain blooming and spreading. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let it slow me down. Around me, the women fought on, fierce and unyielding. This was more than a battle. There was a testament, a reckoning, and as the night deepened, with the moon casting cold light through the trees, I knew that whatever dawn brought, we had carved our defiance into the very bones of this land. The fight for freedom was far from over, but neither was our will to survive. The night stretched on like a wound that refused to heal, bleeding cold shadows through the trees and across our souls. We had been fighting for hours, now hours marked only by the bitter taste of sweat, the sharp sting of pain, and the steady rhythm of gunfire echoing through the forest like a dirge. My shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed me, but pain was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every moment counted, every breath a gamble between life and death. Around me, the women fought with a ferocity born of desperation and ancient pride, their faces painted with dirt and determination. The baby, the fragile heartbeat that had kept us all tethered to hope, slept in the arms of a young woman who refused to let anything come near her. I caught a glance of Ayana, standing tall despite exhaustion that clawed at her bones. Her eyes glowed with a fierce light, the fire of a leader who would rather burn than surrender. We had pushed the soldiers back for now, but the enemy was not beaten. They regrouped beyond the tree line, their voices carrying on the wind, harsh, angry, and determined. The moon hung low and blood-red above us, casting an eerie glow that seemed to seep into the very earth. It felt like a harbinger, a silent witness to the violence and sacrifice unfolding beneath its gaze. I found a moment's respite beside a fallen log, wiping the grime and blood from my face as I caught my breath. The weight of what we had lost pressed down hard, friends who would never rise again, dreams shattered beneath boots and bullets, the heavy cost of defiance. But even in the darkest hours, I felt something stirring, a fierce spark that refused to be extinguished. Ayana approached, her voice a whisper that cut through the cold night. They'll come again, stronger, more prepared. I nodded grimly. Then we make them pay every step of the way. She looked at me, eyes searching. You could leave, go back to the quiet. I shook my head. Not anymore. This is my fight now. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees like silent sentinels watching the battle for souls and survival. We fortified our positions, setting new traps, sharpening weapons, and sharing quiet words of encouragement. The babies stirred, and for a brief moment, I caught the fragile hope of a future that might still be possible. Suddenly a shout pierced the night. The soldiers were advancing once more. We braced ourselves as the battle erupted anew. Bullets tore through the underbrush, and the cries of combatants filled the air. I fired until my hands shook, every shot a lifeline. A young woman fell beside me, blood blooming across her chest. I caught her before she hit the ground, her eyes wide and pleading. I held her hand as she whispered a single word: fight. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The night became a blur of violence and survival, each moment a knife-edge balance between hope and despair. As dawn threatened to break, a terrible calm settled over the forest, the breath held before the storm's final fury. We were battered, broken, but unbowed, and as the first light of day pierced the canopy, I knew the end was near. The first light of dawn sliced through the forest canopy like a blade, casting long shadows over the battleground we had come to know so intimately. The night's chaos had given way to an eerie stillness, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel like it might be your last. But beneath that silence was a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, the calm before the storm's final deadly surge. We had lost too many to count. Faces that once glowed with fierce hope were now pale memories. Yet the fire in our hearts burned fiercer than ever. Ayanna stood at the center of our ragged group, her eyes blazing with unyielding defiance. She was no longer just a leader, she was the embodiment of all that had been taken from us and all that still needed to be fought for. I felt the cold ache of my injured shoulder, the sting of loss from comrades who had fallen beside me, and the crushing weight of responsibility. But surrender was not an option. It never had been. The distant rumble of hooves shattered the fragile silence. The soldiers were coming, the main force, more brutal and numerous than anything we had faced so far. Their boots drummed a war song against the earth, a relentless march toward our last refuge. We hold here, Ayanna said, her voice steel wrapped in fire. This is where we end it. We moved into position, a ragged line of survivors ready to face impossible odds. Every trap set, every bullet loaded, every whispered prayer was for this moment. As the soldiers emerged from the tree line, their faces cold and cruel, I caught a glimpse of the captain who had haunted our nightmares, Morrison's successor. His eyes burned with the same ruthless hunger, but tonight he would find something he hadn't expected. The battle exploded with a violence that shook the forest to its roots. Gunfire tore through the air, mingling with the screams of pain and rage. We fought with everything, every wound a testament to our refusal to yield, every breath stolen from the jaws of death. I found myself face to face with the captain, his rifle raised, eyes full of hate. Time seemed to slow as I aimed my Winchester, the weight of years and grief pressing down. Tonight your hunt ends, I thought, steadying my aim. A sharp crack echoed, and the captain fell, eyes wide with disbelief. Around us, the tide of battle shifted, the soldiers faltered, their confidence shattered by our fierce resistance. But the price was high. The baby's cries pierced the chaos, a haunting reminder of all that was at stake. The youngest woman clutched her tightly, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. The forest was stained with blood and sacrifice, but we stood, broken, battered, but unbroken. As the smoke cleared and the sun rose fully, I looked at Ayanna. Is it over? She shook her head slowly. For tonight, but the fight for justice never truly ends. I nodded, feeling something I hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. hope that from the ashes of this night something new could rise, something stronger. And as the survivors gathered, weary but alive, I knew one thing with certainty: no darkness could ever extinguish the fire of those who refused to be hunted. The battle was over, but the war, the long, grinding war against hatred and fear, was just beginning. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the broken canopy, painting the forest in gold and blood, I felt the weight of every moment we had lived crash down on me. The night had tested us all, pushing our limits and shattering illusions. Around me, survivors moved quietly, tending wounds, comforting the trembling, cradling the baby whose fragile breath had become the heartbeat of our resistance. The women's faces were etched with exhaustion and grief, but also something fiercer, a spark of hope. Ayana stood near the center of the clearing, her posture strong despite the losses. She was no longer the hunted, but a symbol, a living testament to what it meant to fight with honor, to resist with every fiber of your being. I limped toward her, the pain in my shoulder a constant reminder of the price we had paid. "What now?" I asked, voice hoarse. She met my gaze, eyes steady and fierce. "Now, we build. We honor those we lost by making sure their sacrifice means something. We tell our story not just for us, but for every voice silenced by fear and violence." The forest around us was quiet but not empty. The birds began to sing again, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. Life was returning, so were we. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of despair crushing me. The ghosts of my past still lingered, but they no longer controlled me. Instead, they fueled a new purpose. We buried the dead with honor, the soil rich and dark beneath our hands. Each grave was a promise, a vow to keep fighting, to never forget, to carry the torch forward. Ayana spoke of journeys yet to come, of alliances to forge, of healing that would take years, but was worth every step. We were no longer just survivors. We were the guardians of a legacy that would not be erased. As the day wore on, I found a quiet spot by a small stream, the water cool and clear. I knelt, letting the current wash the grime and blood from my hands. It was a simple act, but in it I felt something profound: renewal. The baby's soft coos reached me, a sound that pulled at my soul and anchored me to the moment. Life, fragile and fierce, always finds a way. I thought of Sarah, of my family, of everything I had lost and everything I had gained. The scars on my body and heart told a story of pain and endurance, but also of hope and redemption. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. There would be battles to fight, wounds to heal, and truths to confront. But we had taken the first step, a step into the light. And for the first time in a long time, I believed in a future worth fighting for. The wind stirred the trees, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to say, "You are not alone." I stood, shoulders squared, heart steady. The past was behind me, the future waiting to be shaped. Together we would rise. Together we would live. And in that moment, beneath the wide open sky, I knew the storm had passed, but our story was just beginning. If you were in his place, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video. While you're here, explore the other videos on your screen. There's plenty more stories waiting for you.